I can be good at one thing, be miserable, or I can be good at another thing and enjoy it. I think the latter was the better choice, and I have no regrets.
Hello, and welcome to the Creative Mindset Podcast. I'm your host, Isolde Trachtenberg. In the show, my guests and I explore how we can use creativity to do our best work and live our best lives. I talk with authors, musicians, actors, scientists, and others who are all pushing the envelope to live fully, creatively, and authentically. Listen in to get the scoop on how you can do it too. Hello, and welcome to the Creative Mindset Podcast. My name is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I'm your host. I'm super thrilled that you're here, and I'm really, really happy that Grant Miller, also known as G. Miller, is my guest today. Grant is an author, and I'm going to tell you all about him, and you're going to love this man and his work. You have to know it. So he's, as I said, he's known as G. Miller as an author. He's also a teacher in Waterbury, Connecticut, and the stuff he writes is urban science fiction. So it's brilliant stuff. And it's a 4-book series called The Nephilim Chronicles, and it's an action-packed story with lots of social commentary on the human condition in his home state of Connecticut and across the U.S. He graduated from Fairfield University, and I don't even know how to pronounce this. I'm going to say it's Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern and the Chicago Kent College of Law. So the man is a lawyer as well as a teacher as well as an author. So he's got it going on. He uses his experiences to form his characters and how they view the world. And he's currently working on a new series, which I'm really excited about too. It's called the Archangel series. And that's going to release, the first book is going to release in December 2020, and that one's called Angel of Light. So I'm thrilled to welcome him to the show. Grant, thank you so much for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Oh, me too. This is great. So let me just mention a little something. The vision of this podcast is all about following your creative genius towards your best work and your best life. And you went to law school, but now you're an author and an English teacher. So what made you decide to not practice law and instead move into writing and teaching?
The funny thing is, I was going to be a teacher at first, and I student taught in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I grew up in Connecticut my whole life.
Mm-hmm.
I got so frustrated with my experience there that I wanted to go to law school and change the education system from there. Very idealistic way of thinking. 3 years of law school taught me two things. One, that education policy was not what I thought it was. And two, if I was going to be an attorney, my strengths were actually in the courtroom, and I would have been a criminal defense attorney. Problem is, I was interning it's in Chicago, at the Cook County Public Defender's Office and the Federal Defender, and it was hard for me to even get up in the morning sometimes. I was burning out. I came back, and literally right after law school, I was still in Chicago at this point, but right after law school, I wrote the first novel, the first version of it. I revised it later, and I noticed that no matter what I was doing with my life, I was always writing. In undergrad, I was a spoken word poet, and I was always writing. And in law school, whenever I was stressed, which was often because it was law school,
Sure.
I was writing short stories. And Akila Johnson, the protagonist for my first couple books, was a character that I thought of during law school. And she was a different character than what I eventually decided on for the novel series. But I just gave her own book and her own story. Being a writer, I don't know when I decided to be a writer. I just always was. I've just been writing for years. And I always wanted someone to read my writing. And I'm talking to my mother on the phone one day, and I'm telling her about these short stories I was writing and how people like them. And she got mad at me. She told me, what are you doing? And I said, what? I love to write, and I want people to read my work. And she told me, fine, but stop letting them do it for free.
Smart mother.
No, she said, get yourself published and sell your book. Stop giving it away. So that's what I did with my first novel, which I eventually revised because to this day, I don't think it was my best work. People liked it, but I knew I could do better. Teaching, I went back to teaching, And to this day, teaching is the one job I've had where I'm happy to get up in the morning and go do it. And I could do it for my whole life. I could write my whole life. I could teach my whole life. I
It's
could not have been an attorney my whole life. I'm pretty sure if I stayed the course and practiced law as a criminal defense attorney, I would have lasted maybe 2 years.
well,
And I'm sorry.
I was going to say yes, I understand that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would have lasted about 2 years.
Mhm.
And the crazy part is, I'm pretty sure that I would have been good at it. I just would have been miserable. So I can be good at one thing, be miserable, or I can be good at another thing and enjoy it. I think the latter was the better choice, and I have no regrets.
Nor should you. I have a friend who was a public advocate for children in DC and then became a family court judge. And he did this for over 20 years and he fried to a crisp. He did. And it just, there's I think there's only so much that you can do in the law before you just have to put it down sometimes because it's a big burden to carry. And after a while, if it's not really the thing you truly want, you showed great wisdom, I think, in going, you know what? I'm going to go do something else. And I love that. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the duality here and it's not really a duality. It's being an English teacher and being an author. The two coincide very well. When you teach, what are you teaching? What subjects? I know English, but what do you teach?
So when I first started teaching, um, I had some leeway because I got there in the middle of the school year and they hadn't had a teacher in a little while.
Hmm.
I was replacing somebody who had to be transferred. So I taught the novels that were in the curriculum, like
Hmm.
Jane Eyre and A Lesson Before Dying.
Hmm.
But I also taught legal stuff that I went to law school for. So I taught them some of their rights and everything like that. For A Lesson Before Dying, I had an assignment where I had them literally appeal the main character's conviction because I read through that and all my legal training told me that trial was a joke. So I just had them appeal it and fight for their client. So, the experience I had helped me as a teacher. Now we have a curriculum, we have things set in place a little more. And I'm always following what they say, but I'm always trying to find ways to make it interesting for them. So if there's a way for me to kind of twist things around to increase my student engagement, that's what I'll do. Like we had an assignment called a style analysis essay where they had to compare Tim Burton movies and
Hmm.
find Tim Burton's style.
Hmm.
Maybe one of my students liked Tim Burton. The rest of them, I don't know if they even knew who he was.
Hmm.
So instead, I did Ryan Coogler and I had them watch Black Panther and Creed. And the students enjoyed both movies and they wrote their essays on that. So, I try to find ways to find creative ways to keep them engaged, but I stay focused on the fact that literature is about the human condition. And
Always.
I make it a point to say that because when I was in high school, and I had good teachers, but nobody told me that. Nobody told me why I was in English class. It was just a class to do, and I was a good student who was expected to bring home at least a B in every class. So I did that. But nobody told me, hey, why are you doing this class? So I tell them literature is to discuss the human condition, and that's what we'll talk about in class.
Hmm.
I also want to talk about the English language because with other language classes we go through the rules of the language. Your native English speakers, obviously I don't have to teach you English, but I can show you different dialects of English from around the world and around the country and what they sound like.
Hmm.
We're in Connecticut. We have a distinct accent like everywhere else. It's a mixture between New York or Massachusetts, depending on what end of the state you're on. But we sound nothing like, let's say, Baltimore. So I would show them clips of The Wire, and the actress on there who played Snoop was a native from Baltimore. She had a
Hmm.
Baltimore accent.
Hmm.
So like stuff like that. I would go through it that way. Um, and I haven't had a complaint since, and they seem to enjoy it.
It's fascinating that you do that, and I actually really I admire that and I appreciate it. I was an English major in college too, and this idea of engagement is so interesting because if you happen to be someone who loves literature already, then that's wonderful. But if we're living right now, I think, in so much technology, so much possibility that getting them to look at literature in a through a different lens, if you will, by looking at movies and looking at music and seeing how words and language are used is fascinating. And I think students nowadays would probably, you're right, appreciate it a lot more than something that's more staid. And maybe it's Jane Eyre, maybe it's not Jane Eyre, but if there's a way to make it more relevant to them now, I think that you're very wise in making that happen.
Thank you. I've tried to teach comics. I didn't get there yet. If I can get that in there, I will. But like I've tried to teach villains and heroes as a
Hmm.
unit, and even if I could, I'd love to do like a whole unit or half a class just on a story like Naruto or Dragon Ball Z,
Hmm.
because students watch the cartoon all the time, but they don't study the elements and story plot and plot devices in them, and they're great examples of it. So yeah.
Absolutely. Looking at Miyazaki's work, for example, you would see exactly that the structure, the three-act structure, the conflict, the denouement. It's all there in anime, in graphic novels, in comics. It's there. My husband, who is not much of a reader at all, and it's funny that we got married. His one of his favorite pieces of literature in all the world is The Watchmen,
Okay.
and so for him who does not read, this is brilliant stuff. And
Right.
so there's I think there's a TV show now or a TV series now that's like
Yes.
that.
I
And
haven't seen it yet, but yeah.
yeah, so there's a lot to be said for the elevation of graphic novels and comics into fine literature because the technology around what we can do has changed. We're not in the time of Gutenberg anymore. There are things we can do now that are greater than that. So I more power to you as an English teacher. Yay. I love
Thank
that.
you. Thank you very much.
So let's switch gears just a little bit and talk about your books because what's interesting to me is you decided to create a set of books, all of which I think have Greek mythology inspired main characters and names. They have names like Athena and Apollo and Aquila and Artemis, and yet you put them in this sort of closer to reality setting, this urban fantasy setting that doesn't appear to be much different than the world we're living in. And how did you decide that? And what did you keep and what would you augment as far as the world of the Nephilim?
So, yeah, so it's funny because I actually mentioned this in my stories on Instagram about world creation.
Hmm.
And I joked and said that I cheated a little bit because I didn't create a new world for the Nephilim. I didn't. It takes place in Connecticut mostly, and real towns. Killa Johnson, the first protagonist, she
Hmm.
grows up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and she lives with her mother at first, and then moves to Stratford with her father. The characters a lot of times live where I've lived, and the reason I did that was because I've always felt like Connecticut doesn't get much fiction or media attention, even though Connecticut has some of the similar issues of any other state in the country.
Hmm.
And I wanted to show that. I wanted to show a full picture. Whenever they do show Connecticut, it looks nothing or not much like how I grew up, mostly because I'll see a TV shows in Connecticut and everybody's white. And I'm like, great, but where are the black folks and Latinos that I grew up with around here?
Right.
Where's that going on? And
Hmm.
I I always joke with people that like the show like Gilmore Girls, for example, I saw in high school, and it took me years to realize that Gilmore Girls took place in my state. It's a different world from what I was used to. So I wanted to show the full picture of the state, but
Hmm.
I also wanted to show it through the eyes of a human being who is an advanced human being. They're called Nephilim because the government gives them the acronym NEPH, newly evolved post-humanoids, and then they just call them Nephilim because they think it sounds more poetic in a way.
Mhm.
As the series goes on, Nephilim is actually a derogatory term. As the advanced humans become more accepted into society, it becomes more of a social sin to call them that, because it's a name that they didn't think of for themselves. So the next protagonist I have, Athena, if you call her that, she'll get angry at you. She'll say, I didn't think of that name. I'm an advanced human. Don't call me that. So I kind of created this advanced humans view of the world, in Connecticut, looking at the kind of wealth and disparities and kind of the systemic racism that happens, the political corruption, through the eyes of someone who can do things that no one else can do, and how they take their abilities to address those things. And that starts with Akilla Johnson. Um, I think we spoke before about how Akilla is similar to Wonder Woman. She was actually inspired by Wonder Woman.
Okay.
Yeah, she was. And with Aquila, I asked two questions. I asked, what would it look like if Wonder Woman grew up in America? And then what would it look like if she was black? What would it look like if people saw a black woman doing the things she does? How would they approach her and view her? And from there, Aquila became her own character, who I actually just wrote about this as well. Really has a different personality than Wonder Woman. Um, I always found that Wonder Woman sometimes a little bit too sanitized and how people will kind of see her. She's much deadlier if she wants to be than I think people understand a lot of times. Um, but Aquila to me is more ruthless than Wonder Woman, and it comes from the trauma of growing up in an abusive home with her mother, Alina Harris. Um, and you know, you mentioned the Greek mythology inspirations, and Achilles, looking at his story and how Achilles did things, I never thought of Achilles as a hero in the sense that I saw a hero. I just saw a great warrior.
Mm-hmm.
And whether the great warrior is a hero might depend on who's looking at the great warrior. And I treat Aquila Johnson the same way. Aquila Johnson might be seen as a hero to somebody because you might happen to relate to her. You might be rooting for her. But she also does things in a way that make you question how heroic she is, kind of like the Punisher in Marvel Comics, right? So she that's where the Achilles inspiration kind of comes in. She's a great warrior. That part you can't deny. She can fight. She masters 6 different martial arts. She joins the CIA for a bit. She can handle firearms. She can infiltrate compounds of criminal organizations. She can take down whole outfits by herself. But is she a hero? Is she just a person doing what she feels she has to do? Her most redeeming quality, and for lack of a better phrase, Achilles' heel, is her family. She loves her family, will do anything to protect them, and that can be used against her. So yeah, I mean that's kind of how the story kind of developed. I asked those questions. I had the inspiration to base it in Connecticut, my home state, and from there the story grew.
It's interesting to hear you talk about both Wonder Woman and the Punisher, and it's almost like if they had a love child, she would be Aquila,
Yeah.
because Frank Castle has that same sort of, we can talk about Diana Prince and say she had a really ideal childhood, even though a lot of it was based on training and being a warrior. But Frank Castle, his training, yes, he had that, but also it was the result. He became the Punisher as a direct result of his family being massacred. So
Yes.
so the two of them have this very, their backstories are different, but interwoven. I can see how they would produce, in your mind anyway, someone like Aquila. But I do want to ask you, what does the term hero mean to you? Because you're saying, but is she a hero? And I would love to know from you, what does it mean to be a hero?
Yeah. So that's the hard part, right? Because There are moments when I ask myself that.
Mm-hmm.
And I always say that a hero is somebody who does the right thing most of the time, or at least tries to, and has a moral compass that benefits the greater good. The only problem with that is how subjective is that? You know, like people, some like I would like to say that Batman has a great moral code. He refuses to kill, which is great until you meet a villain like the Joker who kills 600 people because he's still alive. Like he's not going to stop unless you
Right.
kill him. And Joker purposely knows that, so he does it on purpose just to see if Batman will kill him. So, the reason I question if Aquila is a hero is because while I agree with her desire to protect her family and to protect the weak, she uses methods that I would never use. Kind of like Frank Castle uses methods that I would never use. Everyone doesn't need to be killed or tortured just because they did the wrong thing. If the U.S. government did things that Aquila did, I would disapprove, even if they were convicts. So that's kind of where I ask that question. And some of the characters in the show ask her the questions too. She has a best friend who's an FBI agent, and Aquila tells her, your way doesn't get the job done. My way does. And the FBI agent, her name's Sandy Carvalho. Sandy tells her, well, if your way works so well, how come we still have criminals walking around? Like don't act like your way is better than mine just because it's different. So people challenge her and ask those questions because I'm asking the questions. I frankly have a hard time deciding that. But if I had a best way to put it, it would be somebody who has that moral code and who looks out for the best for humanity. But how often do people really do that? And how often do you know if that's their true intentions? And that's the hard part.
Oh, sure. It absolutely is, and it's kind of an age old question because we've had heroes and we've had villains, and then we tend to want to see them in sort of either or situations. That the hero's always going to want to try and do the right thing, and the villain is always going to, because it makes it easier on us. It's when we get into those sort of gray areas where sometimes the hero does do things that are questionable. I remember, I forget which one of the remakes with Henry Cavill Superman movies where he sort of let people die, and there was an uproar in the fan community that he let people die. Superman's never supposed to let people die. And I remember thinking, well, actually, he was weighing the greater good. And so he could not save everyone. And it's like what you're saying about Aquila. She doesn't feel, I think, that she has to save everyone if she's trying to save most people at least some of the time, right? Does that
Right.
make sense what I'm saying?
It
So
does.
so it's fascinating how you're putting it. And I did want to, I'm, as I said, I'm a movie dork. So there's something that you said that I thought was really interesting that I'd like to touch on just a bit more and tie it into Aquila. You were talking about the Joker killing 600 people, and because he's alive, because he can. And he said something in one of the movies, one of the I think it was Heath Ledger's Joker who said this to Christian Bale
Great
in,
Joker.
yeah, really great Joker, absolutely. And he said to him, I am an agent of chaos.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself while watching the movie that I thought he was completely lying. I thought he was completely lying. I think the Joker was extremely careful in how he planned what he did and how he carried it out. So it wasn't chaos. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he knew exactly what buttons to push as part of what he did. So I'd love it if you can relate that to Aquila. Is she more an agent of chaos, or is she careful? Is she reacting the way she reacts because of how she grew up, because she is an advanced human and she can, like the Joker, but is she careful and calculating, or is she more chaotic?
Oh no. Aquila is nothing like the Joker. So to
Okay.
me, Aquila. I'll put it this way: if you left Aquila in the same room as the Joker would be in pieces.
Okay.
Um, However, Aquila's main antagonist was based slightly on the Joker, her mother.
Hmm.
So Alina Harris is a Bridgeport police officer, but a very corrupt Bridgeport police officer. I based her on the Joker, obviously, and Frieza from Dragon Ball Z,
Mm-hmm.
and a real life corrupt cop in Chicago named John Burge, who died not too long ago. And John Burge had kidnapped and tortured how many now? I'm pretty sure it was over 100
Wow.
black males on the South Side, and he would use really brutal methods to get you to sign confessions that he or his cronies wrote. They would beat you, they torture you, they cattle prod you, they put objects up your rectum and shock you. Like he would do these things, and he had a shock box that he would use to electrocute you to get you to agree. Well, Alina doesn't have a shock box, but she's an advanced human, and she has her little section in Bridgeport where nobody tells on her because they're afraid of her, but everybody knows who she is,
Uh-huh.
and she has a habit of targeting black males, and she will find them and kidnap them. So what people tend to do is but when they know when her shift starts, they get all their teenage sons or their husbands or boyfriends, they get them all inside, so she can't find them. And she raises Akilla basically by abusing her. She teaches her how to fight by beating her up every day.
Hmm.
And she's trying to brainwash her into believing that because they have these abilities, they're destined to lord over regular human beings that they're supposed to. Well, when Akilla leaves her house, Alina's always kind of there putting a monkey wrench into it every time Akilla tries to have a normal teenage life. So whenever she tries to go to high school or have a job, and take the bus home, all that kind of stuff, Alina pops up somewhere. And to your point about the Joker being calculating, the Joker kind of was an agent in chaos, but he was a chaos for everybody else. He clearly had a plan in what he was doing. It was to cause chaos for everybody else, but it wasn't chaotic for him, right? Kind of like Peter Baelish would use in Game of Thrones would use chaos to ladder. It's not chaotic for him. He's calm and cool, but it's chaotic for everyone else. Alina's kind of the same way. She
Mm-hmm.
causes turmoil. She does horrible things. I mean, horrible things. I question if Akila's a hero. I don't question if Alina's a villain. Alina's definitely a villain.
Mm-hmm.
Horrible things. She abuses people and attacks them, and it looks random and chaotic unless you figure out what her agenda is and you realize that she's really been planning out her agenda since Akilla was born. And she's been planning this out 20, 30 years in advance. And she has contingencies in case Akilla does this, she can go this way, and backup plans here. And she's very elaborate, and she's very good at making sure that you don't know what the plans are. So to you, it looks chaotic, but to her, it's very calculating. And Akila's kind of always on defense with her until she gets a little bit older. Um, Highly intelligent, highly calculating, just like the Joker, and doesn't seem to have any kind of conscience like the Joker. So if anyone's like the Joker, it's her and another villain who's actually worse than her. We've been talking about Aquila and Alina. I didn't get into Athena and her nemesis Artemis. Artemis is worse in my opinion, but Alina is based on the Joker.
So, wow. Okay.
Yeah, my villains are bad. they're
Yeah, I
they're
I know.
they're horrifying. They're horrifying. They are,
Yeah.
especially Artemis. I haven't gotten into her yet, but Artemis
That's
is
in book 2 or book 3?
Artemis starts in book 2 as a teenager, and
Uh-huh.
she really hits her prime in book 3. And Artemis is I have to back up a little bit to explain her history to get why she's so bad.
Mm-hmm.
Alina is the daughter of a man named Ares, another obviously mythology reference there. Ares and Alina have the same agenda. They want to populate the planet with advanced humans to take it over. Whereas Alina obviously can only have a child every 9 months or so. Ares can impregnate as many women as he wants.
Mm-hmm.
So he starts a cult and he gets women to have his children. And after Alina, Artemis is his oldest child. And Artemis completely buys into Ares's personality and his belief system. Even after Ares passes away, he dies fighting Aquila. Aquila takes him down. And Artemis takes this drug that the government manufactured. Um, And the government made it to kind of give regular humans a leg up. It gives you the same abilities that an advanced human has, but it has serious side effects because
Mm-hmm.
it's still a prototype. Artemis essentially steals it and starts distributing it in the street. And it looks just like the crack epidemic in the 80s. Only the difference is it's not crack that makes you high, it's manna. It's called manna, like manna from the Bible, and it makes you super strong. Like you take it, if you survive the first hit, you can go outside and pick up a car.
Mm-hmm.
And Artemis is like the number one dealer for it, but she's also adopts a very, very extreme neo-Nazi belief system, and she starts her own group called Harris Militia. And she hates my second protagonist, Athena Johnson, because they fought as teenagers, and Athena Johnson whooped her tail. Athena can fight, and Artemis thought she was tough until she met Athena, and Athena embarrassed her. So they get older. Athena, unlike Aquila, Athena actually becomes an activist, gets her PhD at Yale in sociology, starts a nonprofit to actually help combat the drug problems. She's by most definitions a heroic person.
Mm-hmm.
And Artemis and her crew, no matter how much good Athena does, they don't care. They just hate her. They hate her because of her race. Artemis is a personal reason to hate her because she beat her up when they fought as kids. And Artemis does things that when I look back and read it, I'm surprised that I wrote it.
Really?
She's that bad. And the research I did, I dove deep into researching a lot of white supremacist ideology and language and beliefs, and it literally gave me a nightmare. It was so evil. And
That
in
sounds
the night,
surprising.
yeah, in that nightmare, I was walking down the street, down actually the street where I grew up in Stratford, and I saw a pale woman with gray eyes following me. And the way she looked at me, it just looked like pure, cold murder. And it's hard to describe how terrifying it was. So that was the description that I gave Artemis. Artemis is the same gray-eyed, terrifying stare, and the only person who can beat her is Athena. Well, Aquila could have too, but Aquila was getting a little older. Um, but Artemis is kind of like one of her main inspirations was Negan from The Walking Dead,
Mm-hmm.
and how Negan would torture people and hit them with bats and everything like that. Artemis is kind of like that, only Negan had justifications for it. Artemis didn't need a justification. She was just a sadist. And she tortured Athena in ways that were pretty horrifying, but weren't much different from actual human history. And, the question for her is, what do you do when you're faced with someone like that? When no matter how much good you do, they just hate you because you exist. And they don't just hate you, they come after you and try to kill you just because you're there. Like think about it. So what if you fought in middle school? You want to kill me now 10 years later? That's more than the fight. That's your belief system and how you view me as a person. And there's nothing Athena could do to reason with her or talk her down or even scare her. She had to fight her. And Athena, unlike Aquila, Athena did not have that ruthlessness in her unless you really pushed her. And I feel like Artemis was necessary to push her. But by pushing her, she also traumatized her. When you deal with people like that, this is one thing that I think is it's not talked about enough when you're talking about racism. Yes, you look at the terrible things that people have done in the Jim Crow era or in apartheid in South Africa or in Nazi Germany. You look at the terrible things they've done. One of the new words I just learned is necropolitics, and I find it applies so much to a lot of those things. The decision to decide who lives or dies. What we don't always talk about is the psychological toll that it puts the victim through, even if you survive. The PTSD that it gives you. Like when you talk to folks who survived the Jim Crow era, when they sit down and tell you the things they've seen and had to survive and experience, it shakes them to their core. Like my own grandfather told me that he had to leave home at 16 because he was going to get lynched, and he had to lie about his age and join the military. and shipped himself from Mississippi to Alaska, and he almost had a baseball scholarship in Mississippi, and he never played baseball again because he had to leave hundreds of miles away. And he told me that the sadness in his voice was palpable. You can cut it with a knife. Like when you deal with stuff like that, it affects you. You don't walk away unscathed, even if you're the victor. And I think Athena has that same kind of trauma going on later on in the story. So Athena to me is not Athena, sorry, Artemis to me is the worst villain in my whole series. There are other bad villains. Alina's bad, Ares is bad, Xerxes is another one, he's really bad. But something about Artemis is so evil that, yeah, when I look at it, I'm surprised that the words on the page came from me. And I think it's because you research something and you write about it, you ingest it, then you kind of pour it out. And what I ingested was so toxic, I didn't realize how toxic it was until I poured it out and then looked at it on a page and said, wow, that is actually pure evil. Like it is evil. And I wonder if the creator of like the Joker kind of felt the same way after he wrote the Joker. You know, like how do you look at that and say, wow, really?
That came out of my head. Wait a minute. Yeah.
Yeah,
But you know what's interesting? What you just said, it it made me go, because first of all, it's horrifying. The idea is horrifying of having someone who is evil is we throw that word around a lot, but what you're describing sounds like someone is not only evil, but she relishes it. She
oh yeah,
relishes her role. And that makes me go, how does she get power? You know? Like she's an advanced human and I get that. But I'm always curious about villains and sort of the henchmen.
yeah.
How do they follow her? What needs to be wrong with them to hear her, to be inspired by her, to do evil on her behalf?
Well,
You know?
some of them are, well, first of all, a few of them are just as evil as her. Others are, you know, with neo-Nazi groups in particular, what they often do to recruit people is they give them quick and easy answers for their problems.
Mhm.
And the quick and easy answer is you're broke because this Mexican over here took your job. You know, crime is up because black people are criminally inclined and they're the problem. And no real deep research, no real, like I looked up a manifesto by Anders Breivik over in Norway, the white supremacist, and I swear if he turned that paper into me as a high schooler, he would have gotten an F. It was crap, but like it fit what someone must believe. It's a quick and easy answer. And Artemis was really good at giving her followers quick and easy answers. I think cults do that, gangs do that, and it doesn't really matter what kind. So neo-Nazis are no different. And she would kind of get people under her control that way. She had like a Twitter following. She pushed conspiracy theories about Athena. You know, Athena's working to help people get off a drug, and Artemis and her cronies put out a conspiracy theory that they're actually building like a terrorist group there, and that they're actually holding the drugs, and like they push it out there. And if you already have a bias against somebody because of their race or gender, or because of their political affiliation, it's not hard for you to kind of latch onto it if you're susceptible to it. And I think someone like that always finds someone who is susceptible, and they always find someone who goes along with them. I mean, listen, if someone can go along with Charles Manson, someone can go along with almost anybody if they give them the quick and easy answer and gives them something to hold on to. And Artemis was very good at doing that, even if she was doing it for completely evil means. And she has hundreds of people who, there's one scene where she captures Athena and she has her own prison in Hartford, which is actually a stadium, but she used as a prison. And she has Athena literally under her boot, tied up, her head under her boot. And there's a crowd of people in there who all follow Artemis' command. And she says, "This is Athena Johnson, and she's under my boot where she effing belongs." And the whole crowd cheers like it's the greatest thing in the world. They're trained to hate her. And yeah, like there are ways to do that, and it's unfortunate, but it's true.
And so within that, uh what do we do? You know, what do we do to combat that quick and easy answer. Uh, how do we combat people needing the quick and easy answer? Is it a question of the fact that they don't have a sense of self? Is it a question that they're natural born followers and don't know how to stand in their own space? What do you think causes people to be willing to follow someone to such really foul places?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there. I think there's a lack of sense of self. I think there's also a lack of education, and it's kind of weird. There's a lack of education, but most people, and I tell my students all the time this, I tell them that the majority of people you meet aren't stupid, even if they do something foolish, but they can be manipulated. And I'll give you an example of what I mean, because sometimes it's not just the gang or the recruiter that manipulates you; it's also your environment.
Hmm.
So if one, I saw one video when I was in college where they interviewed a young male in Cleveland, right before they built like a new stadium out there, and it's about education. And they asked him why he didn't go to school, and he said, "Well, school doesn't matter." And they said, "Why do you think school doesn't matter?" And he said, "Well, because if it, they just built a new stadium, right, brand new stadium, but my school has cracked windows, the pipes burst every winter, and the books are old and it's in terrible condition. If school mattered, they put more money into my school. They wouldn't build a new stadium." Now, is the kid right that school doesn't matter? No, it's wrong. But his logic is actually pretty sound. Like his reasoning is actually pretty strong. He's not stupid at all. He's noticing that in his society, the message that's being sent to him is that education doesn't matter very much. So sometimes if you have a society that looks a certain way and nobody explains to them why it looks that way, they come up with answers somewhere, somehow, or somebody gives them an easy answer. We have, I think sometimes with education, we have conditions that our students grow up in, not even just students, people in general grow up in, and access to the information about why it's the way it is not accessible enough.
Hmm.
I mean, I didn't learn about redlining, and I knew about Jim Crow, mostly because my parents taught me, but I also learned a little bit in high school, like redlining that affected the northeastern or the north of the country, that kind of stuff, and how the effects still last today, gentrification, all the kinds of stuff like that, that kind of shape how neighborhoods look and shape wealth inequalities and shape how things look. Um, they're not explained to you, but it's right there smack in front of you. So if you're dealing with somebody who is looking at a media perception of Black people always committing crimes, and nobody tells them that maybe if you're suffering discrimination that denies opportunities, that brings more poverty, and then more poverty tends to bring more crime, no matter what race you are, he might just look at it and say, "Oh, well, that's what Black people do. They're just criminals." Or someone can go along and say, "Hey, that's what they do. They're criminals. That's why they're like that. That's why you don't get near them. That's why you don't trust them. That's why we need our police to be as brutal as possible with them to make sure that they stay in their place." You see how I kind of went down that train of thought like that? That's not based on any real research, but that's a quick and easy answer. So like when you see a video of people like the recent Ahmaud Arbery video that came out where someone's getting shot like that, you'll still find people on Twitter who are justifying the shooting. And as someone with a legal education, I watched that video multiple times, as much as I could stand anyway. That was first degree murder. They followed the dude, brought their guns out and shot him. He tried to fight for his life and he lost. And he died on the street. That's murder. But if you've been taught that quick and easy answer that he's the problem, you're going to look at that and you're going to say, "Oh, well, they must have had a good reason to do it." Once that brainwashing kind of already sets in. Artemis is a character who plays on that, and she uses it to her advantage to gain power. I don't know. What I don't know is how to do it at a widespread and fast enough pace to eradicate racism. I wish we could. I wish we could snap our fingers and it goes away tomorrow. But I found that as dedicated as people can be to combating it, there are people who are just as dedicated at keeping it alive, and just as dedicated and innovative at keeping it alive. And I think that we're still seeing that. So, I could think of one way today, and then somebody who wants to keep racism alive will think of another way to keep it alive. So I wish I had a better answer for you.
It's I think you're absolutely right. I think it's entrenched and I think it's institutionalized, and it is the quick and easy answer does not make sense as soon as you think about it at all critically. But I think as a teacher, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I feel like education is pulling us away from thinking critically. So much of it is teach to the test, and
Yeah.
not allowing students to spend time to question and be curious. Instead, it's there's so much. I mean, I've worked a lot in schools during my time as a NASA trainer, and I would
Mm.
go into schools and we would teach STEM essentially, but I call it STREAM because it's science, technology, reading, engineering, arts, and math. But that's my own personal take, because I do believe reading and arts are crucial to a well-rounded person. But that idea of, if you just stop for an instant and you think about all the flaws in the logic about this, thinking that people of color are evil in any way or bad or criminal or whatever, instead of looking at it critically, if you looked at it at all critically, you would realize the fallacy of that. And yet, if you're not, if the focus has shifted away from being a critical thinker, what what do we do to bring that focus back so that people don't just follow the easy answer and don't just follow what feels to me all of a sudden listening to you like a brainwashing technique? What do we need to do?
Well,
I mean,
I think it is. I think it is brainwashing. I mean, I think that's accurate. Um, so I've you'll probably meet many teachers who grow frustrated with having to only teach to the test. I acknowledge what they expect me to do as a teacher and what the standard I'm supposed to reach, but I always make it a point to try to address the human conditions. I think that's how you kind of reach people, right?
mhm,
So I feel like if you to avoid the quick and easy answer in a classroom, all you have to do is not accept it. So you have to challenge it, right? And I challenge it all the time. My student body
mhm,
is majority Black and Latino, and I challenge their quick and easy answers all the time. Sometimes they don't like it, but that's okay because I don't want you to be comfortable. I want you to learn.
mhm,
So I like one of my favorite examples. I showed them an old map of Waterbury and from 1940 when when redlining was still legal, and the neighborhoods are divided up and everything, and the language used to justify the redlining is pretty brutal, and the students still live in those redline neighborhoods.
mhm.
And I asked them, what's the majority race in Waterbury? And they all said, most of them all said Latino or Hispanic. And I told them, what if I told you it's white? And they're like, no, no way. No, no, it's not. I said, well, you don't think that because your school doesn't look that way. But according to the census, it's around 50, I think between 55 to 60% white as a city. So why does your school look like this in a majority white city? And they didn't really know because they hadn't questioned it before. And I asked them, well, if you go to the private schools, what do their student bodies look like? And they kind of all kind of raise their, oh, they're all white. Yeah, okay. So now you're kind of seeing what your city actually looks like when you actually question it. So the opposite end that I'm seeing now that I'm, inside with social distancing on my computer all the time, writing and then going online on social media, is there are people who question, but they seem to think that asking questions and thinking critically are the same thing. But to me, thinking critically is asking questions with the intent to find the truth. If you're
Absolutely.
asking questions with no intention of actually finding the truth, then you're not really thinking critically. So you have folks who ask questions and then they find like YouTube videos or conspiracy theorists that give them, again, the quick and easy answer. Conspiracy theories are always the quick and easy answer. It's incredible. And they often come from folks who aren't qualified to talk. So
Mhm.
like you see that it's the same thing and they buy into it and then they share it like wildfire. So you have misinformation going out there from folks who don't critically think, but they think they are. And I've tried talking to them, and I've found that it's an exercise in futility sometimes. At least my students, they actually learn. If they challenge them, they challenge, but they at least learn. Grown folks do it. It's like, oh my god, you know. But it's after a while when you ask enough questions, because I'm the person with legal education and journalism education, I'll ask questions, I'll poke holes in something if there's a hole in it, and they just stop responding because again, it's not quick and easy, so they shut down. And I don't know, I feel like we have to be trained to not settle for the quick and easy, and to question with the intent to find the answer. Because after a while, sometimes they'll tell you, well, nobody knows for sure. Well, if you don't know for sure, why are you spreading the information in the first place? You don't know if it's reliable. Shouldn't you check first? You know? So
An excellent question.
yeah, like if you don't, I'm serious. I've seen folks do that. They say, well, we don't really know for sure. Well, if you don't know, why did you share it? I don't know, but I didn't share it. Um, so yeah, I mean, you can
It's
tell I'm
very
frustrated.
logical.
Yeah, well, you can tell I'm frustrated by it. I am. I find it irritating, and I find it less irritating with my students because they're freshmen in high school. They're 14. You know, it's my job as the adult to teach them how to do that. You know, but my concern is that while I'm trying to teach them how to think critically and question things and research things and not settle for the easy answer, I worry if at least some of them are going on YouTube and listening to other adults who give them the quicker, easy answer, and it's a easier answer than I give, so they might gravitate towards that, you know. And I don't know how you stop that. I know that nowadays, lately, YouTube and Instagram, they're taking posts down that spread misinformation and propaganda, and people are saying that it's censorship. One lady I spoke to wondered if it was like what did she call it? I think she called it like a did you say like a dictatorship or a communist, something like that. To which I reminded her that if you were actually in an oppressive country, you wouldn't even be allowed to ask that question. Um,
Absolutely.
you know, I said, I don't think you understand what a oppressive regime is. Like journalists don't live very long in those places. They die. They're targeted and killed. Like I think you're kind of going overboard. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's on one end you want to think critically so you're not duped into joining a cult or a gang or a toxic organization or group. On the other end, you want to make sure that your questions actually lead to the truth and that your discussions are actually designed to for both of you to learn something. So I think some folks will argue with you to try to trap you into confirming their confirmation bias instead of having an actual discussion. Um, so yeah, that's the challenge. It's like a balancing act.
It is. And it's also really interesting what you just said sparked something in me that when I think about it, it takes a certain level of maturity to go, "Oh, I was wrong. I got taken for a ride." And so in some of the discussions that I've been having about some of the things that are going on right now, people double down. They double down
Yeah.
on their ignorance and on their racism and on their sexism. They're like, "No, this is how it's supposed to be." And at some point, I honestly, I have to walk away because I don't have a method of reversing that, and it's something I'm very curious about, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about this. You're a person of color living in Connecticut, and you no, I mean, this is important,
Yeah.
to acknowledge right now because with Ahmaud Arbery, you said, this was murder, and I have no doubt that it was murder. But you've got boots on the ground. You're a man of color living in Connecticut. You live with this every day.
Mm,
You know, W- w- if we're talking about the state of racism, because I do want to address sexism too, because your books have female protagonists and antagonists and they're women of color, so I'd like to talk about that too, but
sure.
I'd love to get your thoughts on that, you being a man of color living today with so much for you to worry about. Walking outside can be a problem. Taking a jog can end your life.
Yeah.
How do you approach that? What do you do to keep living your life, and how do you feel about that?
So when I saw that video, it numbed me, it kind of shocked me, right? But if I'm being honest, that worry is always in the back of my head, and it kind of always has been. I've experienced. I feel like in Connecticut, you see a lot of structural racism going on, a lot of inequality, but uh, in both, well, really in all levels. I'll put it that way. Um, but really, like the reality that somebody could really hate me because of my race and might even do something bad about it hit me when I lived in Chicago. Um, Chicago, to me, that's the only place where somebody called me the N-word to my face,
Hmm.
and twice. And it's a different kind of environment out there. And I never forgot this. When I was a law clerk out there, I had a 7-Eleven license, which means I can argue in court as long as an attorney's with me. And I cross-examined a police officer who illegally stopped and searched a black male. And I won the motion, and it was a stacked court. The guy in the stand was a cop. The judge was a former cop. And Chicago PD is not known for being very nice to black people in Chicago at all.
Mm.
And I'll never forget this. The cop, after I cross-examined and I won the motion, the judge didn't like it. I had my closing argument, and the judge cut me off. He granted me the motion, but he clearly didn't enjoy what I was saying. Um, I never forgot the way that cop stared at me from the stand out of the courtroom. I just knew that if I saw him again, he would shoot me or he would do something to me. And he wasn't white either. I don't know what his nationality was, but he looked pretty dark, like a lighter tan or dark brown skin. But didn't matter, to him. He expected to get away with doing what he was doing, and I find that you have to be constantly aware of that. I enjoyed Chicago, but I didn't want to stay there. I have family out there, and they obviously have lived their lives for a long time out there, and they've made it. I was so nervous. I was out there when Laquan McDonald was shot
Mm.
by that officer, and I looked at that and said, if I settle down with a family, I don't want that to be my son or
Right.
daughter. You know, it's something you're always thinking about, and it's something that generations of black people have always had to think about, and something that when you're a kid growing up with black parents, they warn you about it. And I never forgot a conversation I had with my parents where before I went to college, they told me, if you see a girl on campus who's stumbling drunk and she's walking in your direction and she looks like she's really intoxicated, what do you do? And my naive self, I said, well, I make sure she gets back safely, and make sure she lies on her side so she doesn't choke on her vomit like that. And my parents went, no, you don't do that. And I was like, what? And they're like, when you see her, you cross the street. And I said, what? They said, you're a black male. If something happens to her and you are the last person seen with her, you're in trouble. And I didn't get what they were talking about until I learned more about a lot of American culture. And I totally understand now why they were so afraid. And I posted about that video because, Mr. Arbery he wasn't doing anything from what I could tell. He was just jogging. And he must have felt safe enough to jog in that neighborhood the same way I felt safe enough to walk around my neighborhood. And my neighborhood's a safe neighborhood. It's nothing really happens here. It's a section of Hartford that doesn't really have a whole lot of crime that I know of. I don't worry about getting robbed or getting shot or anything like that. And I didn't worry about it when I went for a walk. And then I came home and I saw this guy who went jogging, and I don't know what he was thinking, but I'm sure he at least felt safe enough to jog. And it wasn't safe enough to jog, and it wasn't safe enough because he existed. I mean, The reasoning and excuses people have for why he got shot don't match any justifiable reason to shoot someone. He didn't do anything. He was just there. And that kind of that feeling in the back of your head that you always have when you watch a video like that and you know it could happen to you anywhere in the US, excuse me, it kind of brings it from the back of the head to the front of your head. And it's hard to even respond at first. It took me a minute to even write what I wrote, um, and even have much of a response. It's like I was just shocked and frozen. And I'm fortunate that in Connecticut, I haven't had. I mean, I've seen some racism out here, obviously, and some towns are different than others. Um, I haven't had a whole lot of incidents out here, but there are still parts of Connecticut where I don't want to stop when I drive because I worry that if I stop at the wrong place, I might not. That might be the last place I stop. And it's just something that I feel like almost every Black person you'll meet is aware of in everything they do. Not just walking down the street, even at work. I'm a teacher, I'm a Black male, I'm 6'2", 210 pounds. If I raise my voice at the wrong person, I always worry what could happen.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody decides I'm too threatening, I could lose my job. I worry about those kind of things. And I haven't had any problems with my staff or my vice principal or principal. They've all been very supportive of me. Just living in America has taught me to always be aware, even if things look good, you know? So yeah, I mean, you mentioned I was Black in Connecticut, and I sometimes joke with people and say that if you meet a person who was Black and grew up in Connecticut and tells you that racism's over, they're either in denial or they're lying. you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, that thought is always in your mind. It's always in your head, and those videos kind of serve as reminders. And it's kind of like America rubbing it in your nose that people still engage in a kind of necro-political execution. They decide that they're the ones who get to decide whether you live or die. They don't need police. They'll just do it. Or they'll call the police and hope the police will do it. And they just decide that I find that racists often believe that if a Black person benefits, they suffer. So they believe their survival is based on making you suffer. And I don't know what those men were thinking in the moment that they shot him. I doubt it was anything good. I doubt that if you spoke to them, they had kind things to say about Black people. I don't get the impression that they were kind people, but I bet they felt like they were entitled to just take him out like that because that's what they believe, and they think that their life is more valuable than mine without even knowing me. And that's kind of something you have to be aware of every day, living in this country and others, but this is the country that I have obviously the most experience with.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the one I can comment on the most.
Oh, I don't have any response to that. Uh, the thing that I'm thinking about with everything that you just said, and thank you so much for being so incredibly articulate and poignant. Um, what what I'm thinking about in hearing what you just said is that it's that feeling of constant awareness that and with Ahmaud Arbery, it's so strange to think that it was regardless of whether or not he was aware, in that moment he was it's about the right to take up space. It's about the right to exist and to feel that you deserve to exist and to be here and to take up space. And they these two men took that away from him. And it doesn't matter to me, honestly. It just doesn't matter what he was doing. They had zero authority. They had zero authority to take action like that. So I'm with you. I'm thinking, life without parole is a pretty good, uh,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
a pretty good ruling if I were queen. But
Right, right. And the
but
thing is, they decided they had the authority. They
right,
decided that they had the right to do that, even though if they actually thought he was committing a crime, the legal thing to do would have been to call the police. But
exactly,
instead, they got out there and did that.
right,
They decided they were allowed to do that in their mind.
right, and that's the thing that just it angers me on the deepest levels because obviously they didn't have the authority and to have feeling like you have the right to take the authority. I wonder if that's part of the institutionalization of it all,
Yes,
that there is this. And I personally, I mean, I find it abhorrent on every level, and yet I'm a fixer personality, so I wonder, what do we do about it? Every time I want to ask that question, what can we do to change that perspective? Because it's obviously 100% wrong. That goes without saying, but how do we change it? You know? What are the steps? Where do we start?
I think that well, first I'm going to address the belief that they can do that. I think it comes from beliefs that are passed down. I genuinely believe that a lot of beliefs that existed in slavery still exist today, and they
Mm,
still exist today because people pass them down to their kids, who pass them down to their kids, and yada yada. It's a phrase that I often use to describe this mentality. I actually wrote about it on a Medium page a little while ago. I call it the assumption of consumption.
hmm,
And it's when a white person looks at a person of color, or if you talk about sexism, the way a man looks at a woman, and they assume that you're there for their use and consumption, and if you're not there for use and consumption, then you can be discarded.
hmm,
And if you're not their slave, think about it. Like, why are you nervous about a black person in your neighborhood? If he was a slave, he'd be in your house, right? So if you're not using him, then you feel like he can be discarded if you're not using him for your own means. And it's that mentality that I think is the first thing that needs to be extinguished when you need to look at everyone as a human being, not while ignoring the race. I think that's a mistake folks make. They say, I don't see color. No, I don't want you to not see my color. I'm proud to be a black male. You need to look at me and see a black male and see a human being. You gotta do more work than that. you
right.
know? And I think you should look at someone and see a human being who is not an object to be consumed or discarded, and is not a wild animal to be put to death if it attacks you, if you think it's going to attack you. Like, I think that the first thing you have to do is deal with the structures that we have in place, and you have to break them down. That, I don't know how long that would take, because you get one hell of a fight
Mm,
doing that, because there are people who benefit from it. you know and, like, just for example, we had a first black president before Trump, and when he had the majority in Congress, he did his thing. After that, man, the Republicans were blocking him like crazy,
yeah.
and people were joking and said, well, racism's over, we have a black president now. So, okay, but Congress is still majority white in both parties. I don't think it's over yet. You still have to break things down further. You have one position, and he's the first, with 43 white males before him. If you think racism's over, it's because you're tired of doing the work. Okay, that's what that is. You don't want to
Mm,
go any further. And I think that you'll get a fight doing that, but the fight will be worth it. Break things down. You still have quite a bit of segregation in the U.S. Even without Jim Crow, you still have quite a bit of de facto segregation.
mhm,
And I've always found, and I've spoken with folks who are more separatist. I'm not a separatist. If I was around during the civil rights era, I would have been integrationist all the way, and I still am. I think integration is important because it's a lot harder to convince somebody of stereotypes about black people if they have black neighbors. Because if you tell someone, oh, they're all thugs and gangsters, well, that's interesting because Grant's my next door neighbor, and he's a teacher. And Gloria over here is my next door neighbor, and she's an accountant. Well, they all go to prison. Well, neither of them have been to prison ever in their life. I don't know what you mean. So I don't believe what you're saying. Whereas if you have a neighborhood where everyone's all the same race or same color, not everyone's going to believe it, but some will, because they don't have any exposure to someone who's different from them. It's easy to dehumanize somebody from a distance. We see that now with folks who talk a lot of junk about people from other countries. If you tell someone about the Middle East or anywhere like that, they believe that they're all these raving extremist savages. But if you actually meet somebody from there, they're human beings just like anybody else. I've had people tell me they're worried about Muslims, and I tell them, I live in Chicago. I pass by Muslims every day on public transit, and nobody ever bothered me. You know, you see them for human beings when you're actually exposed to them. I think that's a part of it. I don't know if that's the final steps. I think there are a bunch of other things too. We have,
Sure.
but I think if you're allowed to be exposed to people, you're allowed to see them as people. And maybe you shouldn't need to see them as people, but I think that would help. you know.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny because to me, seeing people as individuals rather than lumping them in with a perceived notion of a group is, I think, it's critical, it's crucial. And yet, it's interesting what you're talking about with being an immigrant. I'm an immigrant. I was born in the former Soviet Union, and my family immigrated when I was a child. But unless I tell you that, other than my strange name, you're not going to know that. There's nothing that sets me apart in that way. You know what I mean? So people, when they find out, when I've been in conversations where someone is raging against immigrants, and they say, blah blah blah, bad immigrants essentially, and I say, well, I'm an immigrant, and they're like, well, I didn't mean you.
Oh, they meant
And
brown folks.
yeah, exactly. And it's just it's infuriating because
Yeah.
what? and
Yeah.
and and so it's this really, there's a cognitive dissonance there that then I have to sort of break things down and go, okay, let's talk about people versus a person and what it means, and let's talk about all of these things. And so we end up having these conversations where well, I didn't mean you ends up being a teaching moment.
Right.
It's because it boggles my mind. It really does. I don't have a better way of describing it. The first time I heard that, because I've heard it multiple times, um I had to step back and go, okay, what can I do to make this a teachable moment? Because otherwise I'm going to run screaming from the room. So I think there are so many opportunities like that for all of us. That please correct me if I'm wrong, and please tell me if I'm overstepping my bounds, but I don't think it's just up to people of color to work on this issue. I think we all can work on this issue. You know what I mean? I think we all have a responsibility to work on it and to make it better.
But it's not on people. It's not all on people of color, because people of color aren't the ones who benefit from the racial discrimination. So
There you
like,
go.
yeah, so it wouldn't just be on them. That would be like saying it's on women to stop sexism. Well, no, that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
You know. So
Right.
like, yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned the immigration story, because we've seen a lot of anti-immigrant language really since 2016,
Hmm.
when Trump won the election. And um, people would say, well, he doesn't mean all immigrants. Well, he's kind of intentionally only talking about Latinos and people from the Middle East, really. Um, and we don't really, that feeds into beliefs that people kind of already had about
Hmm.
people who are not white. And I think, again, people buy into that, and they don't realize that what they're saying could be hurtful to you, because they assume, first of all, they probably looked at you and assumed you weren't an immigrant. That's the
Right.
first thing. Their default idea of American is somebody who could identify as white. And then they feel like calling you like the exception is supposed to make it better.
Right.
you know
Exactly.
and it doesn't. It's like, no, you're cool, you're in the club, so it's
Right.
okay. They're not in the club, so they're not okay. And it's that kind of othering of people
Hmm.
I kind of want to stop. And I agree that it's not just on people of color, though I find that what's damaging sometimes is that, again, if you don't provide critical thinking, people have quick and easy answers. And
Mm-hmm.
while I don't think that racism goes both ways, I do think prejudice does. So I have students, again, who are mostly black and brown, and they would always say that white people are crazy. And I tell them, well, no one race is crazier than the other. And they would say, well, how come it's only white folks doing mass shootings? And I said, okay. So now we have what they've seen, and then we have the quick and easy answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I tell them, have you ever considered that it's not because white people are crazy, it's because black people aren't really allowed to be crazy. Like if a black person walks towards a movie theater with a whole lot of guns and weapons, do you really think that he's gonna make it in there?
Right.
They go, oh, no. Okay, well that explains the Aurora, Colorado shooting, right? Or in the Las Vegas, they got all those guns in that hotel room. You really think black folks with all those guns would have made it in a hotel room to shoot up a concert? No.
Right.
Okay, so the issue isn't how crazy that person is. The issue is how no one looks at them and assumes that they could be criminally inclined. Meanwhile, my students have stories about people calling the cops on them just for walking into a grocery store. You
Mm-hmm.
know, so like I told them, have you guys ever noticed that whenever you walk into a neighborhood, you walk into a store, that somebody looks at you or follows you or watches you? And they said, yeah. I said, all right, that's the assumption of criminality. They look at you and they
Mm-hmm.
assume you're criminal. If people look at you and assume you're criminal, could you get a gun and do a mass shooting? Well, no, the cops would stop you before you even do. All right. So the difference here is that you're suffering from an assumption of criminality. These mass shooters don't until they actually commit a crime.
Right. They get the presumption of innocence instead of the assumption of criminality. It's very true.
Yes.
It's very
My
true.
favorite story is Jeffrey Dahmer. And I always talk about how Dahmer had one of his victims running naked out of his house screaming for help.
Yeah.
And I told them, do you guys think that if a kid ran naked, run out of my house, the police would have brought him back? I said, no. So, okay, so was the issue how crazy Dahmer was or the fact that they believed Dahmer? Right? So that's kind of how you kind of address those quick and easy answers I'm kind of going back to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, I don't know, if you can get everybody to be open to releasing themselves from the quick and easy answer. I mean, I agree that there are teaching moments. I have a good friend of mine who asked me a question. I gave her all the information I had, and we're great friends to this day. Before that, she didn't really know much, and she had some beliefs that, in hindsight, were racist. But she doesn't believe that anymore. But that's only because she was open to receiving the information.
Sure.
I've spoken to folks who weren't open to receiving the information, and for me, for my own mental health, if you're not open to receiving it, I'm not going to keep trying with you. I'll move on and talk to somebody else.
Right.
You know, my grandfather, and I tell a lot of stories, you probably noticed. My grandfather,
I love it.
um, thank you. My grandfather told me something. He had a really unorthodox way of viewing the world, but it kind of worked. And he asked me one day, I forget why. I must have been complaining about something. And he said, Grant, would you argue with a stop sign? And I said, well, no. And he said, well, that's how you look when you argue with a stupid person. You look like you're standing on the street corner yelling at a stop sign. And, you know, he was calling the person stupid, but what he's really talking about is somebody who's not willing, they're willfully ignorant, is
Right.
probably the better way to put it. And if you stand there arguing with them, after a while, it tears away at you.
Right.
So you have these teaching moments, right? But they also have to be willing to be taught, which is to your point about how it's not just on people of color. I can talk about racism until I'm blue in the face. I can write 6 more books with racist villains. My villains are almost always racist. And if somebody reads that and they're not open, they're gonna walk away from it. They'll probably call me, I don't know, what's the social justice warrior or a libtard or whatever those derogatory phrases are, and close the book and not be open to it.
Right.
Whereas somebody who's open to it will read it and they'll gain something from it. So it is a two-way street. It's not just on the people who are being oppressed. It's also on people who are either oppressing or benefit from it to also be open as well. It's like James Baldwin would always kind of talk about that. And he said one of his letters he told, I think it was a cousin of his. I'm probably misquoting that, but he said that don't hate white people, pity them because they've been lied to their whole lives.
Mm.
They've been taught that they're superior based on their race, and then they meet someone like me and they realize they're not. I'm paraphrasing, but if anybody thought they were going to out talk or out debate or be more intellectual than James Baldwin, they had another think coming after about half an hour.
I like the
Right?
way you put that. But it translates to other ideas and other facets of what we're talking about. I have a story about I have a friend who his name's Glenn and he is 6'5", probably weighs about 260, and I'm 5'6", and I don't weigh 260. And we were talking once and he said, Zolda, it's really interesting to me that between the two of us, I never have to worry about walking down a dark street. I never have to worry. And I said, yeah. And he goes, you do. I'm like, yeah, I do. Women are always concerned about walking down a dark street or past alley openings. We just always are. That's just something that happens to every woman. And he goes, yeah. And he goes, but between the two of us, you're a trained martial artist and I'm not. So no one ever messes with me. But if they did, I wouldn't be able to defend myself. But if they messed with you, they'd draw back a stump. So it's really interesting to me that I have this built-in defense mechanism by virtue of being a very big man. I never had to learn how to fight. And I thought to myself, there's something very poignant there because I did. I started studying martial arts when I was 14 years old and have kept up with it because I wanted to be able to defend myself. And I don't look I'm a kind of a middle-aged lady. I don't look like I could kick someone's butt, but I could. And so for Glenn, that was a really telling moment when he realized that he never had to worry about it, and I always have to worry about it.
It's funny you say that. Not funny, but it's kind of interesting you say that because I didn't get it. I didn't get how women felt walking down the street until I was being kind of bothered by another man in Chicago.
Mm,
As a bigger guy than me, and he wouldn't leave me alone. And it got to the point where I would get on my phone to ignore him, and he would talk to me while I was on the phone. He was
mm,
aggressive. But at the time, I was around 180. He looked about 220 of pure muscle. And I told myself, if this guy won't leave me alone, I don't think I can fight him off. Now I'm more worried than I've ever been before just walking around. I actually went and got a knife just for him in case he attacked me.
hmm,
And that was when it kind of hit me. It didn't hit me yet. It hit me when a woman told me how she felt when men catcall her. And I got a glimpse. And I call it a glimpse because the difference is that was one incident for me.
hmm.
For a woman, it's multiple times in a week, multiple times in a day, depending on where she lives.
Right.
And I did not get it. So, like, a lot of men don't get that. Like, the only time, even as a black male, the only time I'm worried is if I'm in an area where I believe someone might profile me.
Mm,
But I generally don't worry about walking down the street in an area where I think it's cool, you know? Whereas, and what I'm worried about is different too. Like, I would worry about corrupt police officers or about those guys like the ones in Ahmaud Arbery's video. I don't worry about every single person I see
hmm.
who happens to be bigger than me. And I would tell my female friends who want men to relate, I say, if you want men to understand what it's like to worry about catcalling, don't have women catcall them. Get the biggest, most jacked man you could find and have him catcall at him and ask him how he feels. I'll bet money he feels scared. And I feel like a lot of men don't know that. I think we don't think of it.
Hmm.
Um, we don't really, it doesn't process for us because there's a privilege there. We're the bigger, physically stronger, usually anyway. I mean, I don't want to make generalizations, but usually bigger and stronger. So we don't worry about that so much. And that's a privilege in itself.
It's interesting. When you say that, the thing that came to my mind was it is a privilege. And somewhere in there, there is I don't know how to say it without overgeneralizing, but I'm going to say it anyway. I feel like there's the opportunity to to be a protector, to be a caregiver, and that being the benefit that's wrought by being physically bigger and more able in that way. And yet there's it's a we can talk about sexism as issues of power over, of course, but what I'm always curious about is how do we turn that feeling of dominion into a feeling of protection? What would we need to do in order to make that happen? And I would love to ask you specifically what your thoughts are, and additionally to talk about that with respect to your books,
Sure.
because you did a double whammy. Not only are your protagonists people of color, but they're women of color. So
Yes.
you went sort of to the nth degree there and created people who have, characters who have challenges by virtue of being who they are, but also gave them super intelligence and super or heightened intelligence and heightened physical prowess to be who they are, regardless of those other situations or ideas that are going on with respect to racism and sexism. I know it's a big loaded question, but I'd love to
Yeah.
know your thoughts.
So with the protection thing, it's interesting you mentioned that because when I was growing up, I I think maybe it's because of the men in my family kind of led this by example. Being a protector was common sense to me. Now, granted, when I was a kid, I was not physically able to be much of a protector. I was very, very thin and not very strong.
Hmm.
As I got older, I when I heard about these men who were more predatory than protective, I didn't like them. And the first thought I had was, and this is not necessarily, it's not helpful to tell a woman this in this context, but I would say, well, it's not really a man. And the reason I would say that was because protector seemed like common sense to me. Like with my dad, if somebody tried to harm my mother, good luck to that dude. He's in deep trouble. Grandfather, same thing. My grandfather I grew up with, my mom's stepdad, my grandfather Philip Crosby. May he rest in peace. He passed away a lot of years ago. The
I'm sorry to hear
kindest
that.
man I've ever known to this day,
Hmm.
unless you screwed with his family. And he never showed me that side because I was a kid. But I would hear about some stories and I realized he was a protector. If you messed with him, his wife, his grandkids, daughter, or even like a sister-in-law, you were in trouble. He had a problem with you, and if he didn't see right away, he would find you. And like to me, that protector role, I guess the flaw in it is assuming that because someone's a woman, they can't protect themselves, which you shouldn't assume. But I have to wonder why. I wonder why so many men don't act like protectors and are more concerned being predators. And I think part of it is that assumption of consumption that I was talking about.
Hmm.
They view women as objects to be pursued and captured and then protected, but protected the same way you might protect your property. You know,
Right.
not protected like someone who is a human being who needs your help.
And it's what you're saying is really interesting, and I want to interject real quickly. The thing to me about Protector, I'm in the middle of reading *Sapiens*. I don't know if you know, you all Noah Harari's book *Sapiens*, which is sort of a survey of the development of Homo sapiens as a species. And
Okay.
in talking about that, the protector role was not specifically against other men, although it could be, but it was against like the megafauna. So you have, you
Right.
have these big animals or whatever. And to me, I tilt at the windmills of thinking, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful if we lived in a on a planet where protection didn't have to take the form of from other people who are predators, who are trying to take advantage of someone who is weaker or who is more vulnerable than them. That's sort of my thought on it. it would be really nice if we lived in a world that was like, and I know I'm being Pollyanna-ish, but there's something really compelling to me about that idea that if we were all looking out for each other in that way, then then we would have no need for some of these other institutions that are supposed to stop people who want to take what's not theirs to take.
Well, I haven't read the book, but I question if there was ever a point where we all look out for each other, because even like animals now don't do that. Like they don't, like lions don't look at another lion and say, "Oh, we're lions, we're cool." No, they try to kill each other and take each other's pride, right? So I feel like you always had to kind of deal with that. Granted, I haven't done the research on
Mhm.
that this author's done, so I don't know enough context there.
Oh, there's no historical record for that specific thing like that everybody got along. That's not
Oh, okay.
what I meant was that the protection in my mind in that kind of situation was against something like an apex predator like a lion or a tiger or something like that, that whatever went on between the people themselves, there's no we don't have any particular evidence, but
Mhm.
there was evidence of protecting against apex predators like the big cats and things like that, and bears. So and mastodons, although they tended to leave Homo sapiens alone.
Right.
But
Okay.
but within that framework of, you know, women being needing to be protected or something like that, it's, to me, honestly, it's I love being a martial artist. I love having agency. And I've had one situation in my life where I could not protect myself one time in my 53 years. And that was because there was a guy named Lewis who didn't feel pain. And when he
Oh,
decided that I was going home with him, he grabbed me. We were in a bar with a bunch of friends, and he grabbed me and he was holding me. And I was trying to get away, and I could not, because nothing I did affected him. And he was about 6 feet, weighed about 280, 300 pounds,
oh, he's
big
huge.
guy who felt no pain, no pain, all muscle, felt no pain, and there was nothing I could do. And a friend of mine who actually lives in Connecticut, he talked him down because I couldn't. There was nothing I could say in that moment. And having a friend who was there, who was just like, Lewis, man, this isn't cool. You have to stop. She's obviously not interested in going home with you. Was everything, because he had the courage. And he said since then that was the most scared he's ever been, because Lewis was the kind of guy who would have easily killed you, no problem, which we did not know at the time. So having someone in your corner like that is amazing when you have that. And so when I think about that protector role, I think about that moment that my friend John stepped up and said, "This is not cool. You have to stop." And
But
because I
that's good he
couldn't.
did that, and
Yeah,
it's good he did that, and we need more of that. And I think
exactly.
we need more of that before he grabs you. We need
Absolutely.
we need to have conversations. Men need to have conversations with each other to check that,
Right.
because we're taught a lot of things that, in my opinion, are toxic, and maybe it's just to keep friendships or stay in the in crowd, but we don't challenge them enough.
Mhm.
Like, I once spoke to a guy who I'm no longer friends with, because he frankly was creepy. But he was talking about a woman he knew, and he wanted to date her. She didn't want to date him. And he said, "Well, she doesn't know what she wants, so I'm deciding this." And I told him, I said, "Well, let's assume, first of all, she probably does. Most people may not know what they need, but I haven't met a woman who didn't know what she wanted." But I
Right.
told him, let's assume you're right. Let's assume that she doesn't know what she wants. Who made you the expert? Why are you the one who gets to decide what she wants? Don't you think that's sexist? Like, why are you the one? And he actually sat there and said, "Huh, I didn't realize that." Yeah, like, why are you the one who decides? Because you know what? At the end of the day, if she doesn't want you and she doesn't know what she wants, it's none of your business. It's
Right.
not. It's not up to you to decide. She'll have to figure that out on her own without you. You know. I later realized that he was had other issues going on. I had to distance myself from him. But I feel like those conversations need to be had, and some guys they don't want to hear them,
Right.
but you know but we hold men hold each other accountable all the time on other things. So I
Hmm.
don't know why we can't hold each other accountable for that, because we will. We will hold each other to account for stuff. If a man feels like his friend is not standing up for himself, he will certainly tell his friend, "Hey, why are you letting that person chump you?" You know. But if a man is talking to his girlfriend in a certain way, most folks want to mind their own business in relationships, but if someone's being toxic, you gotta tell them. And
Hmm.
I've told my students, if they think someone did something and they call them gay and like a negative thing,
Hmm.
I always correct them. I'm not a homosexual myself, but I always tell them there's nothing wrong with someone being gay. Like, who cares if someone's gay? It's not your business. But I also point out to them, I said, I feel like you guys have a stronger reaction to a man being gay than to a man abusing his girlfriend. Because I've seen boys act abusive toward their girlfriend in this hallway, and I've had to step in, and I didn't hear you guys saying anything in that moment, you know. But if someone does something slightly feminine, in your opinion, you're in an uproar about how gay they are. Don't you think there's something off about that? Because I've seen boys, and it starts early. It starts really early. They're
Hmm.
abusive. I'm assuming they learned it somewhere along the way, and you have to step in. And they don't like it when I step in. The boys don't like it at all. But their response to me is a lot different than to the girl they just grabbed,
Sure.
because I'm bigger and stronger. They'll talk tough, but then they'll walk away because they're scared. you know, um, but like you have to kind of. I feel like more people should do that. I'm forgetting his name now because I'm bad with names sometimes. But the writer for the Wire is a brilliant man. Um, he was talking about economics and society in general, but I think this applies to what you're saying.
Hmm.
He said we always talk about personal responsibility, but we don't talk enough about collective responsibility. And it should be a collective responsibility, I think, to not sit back and watch while someone acts like, what's his name, Lewis, like Lewis acts
Right.
like that should be a collective responsibility. More than one person seeing that should have said, "Whoa, what's going on?" I have seen that, just not often enough.
Hmm.
Like in Chicago, I saw a woman, she was crying and her boyfriend was screaming in her face and calling her all kinds of names and calling her stupid and ugly. And I was across the street, but a group of men came over and they said, "Hey, hey, what's going on over there?" And the guy walked away and they checked with, "Hey, later, you okay?" And if that guy didn't walk away, I'm pretty sure that group of men would have stepped in, and if he caused too much trouble, they would have beat him down. Because in Chicago, there are no punks in Chicago. You want to fight, you'll get one out there. So you will.
I
You'll
grew
get
up in Detroit. I understand.
one. Yeah. So like, I wish I see more of that. And I won't front like I'm perfect. I've had moments where I've watched things happen, didn't do anything. And one day I just told myself, you know what, the next time something happens, you're gonna do something, because you can't you can't keep watching this stuff happen and you do nothing. At some point you can't just mind your own business all the time, you know?
Absolutely. And it's the thing about that is that what you said, it's a collective event, not an individual event. It shouldn't be. It doesn't have to be one person going, I see something that's off and I'm going to step up. We should all have that. I think we can all have that. We can build that in ourselves and each other. That idea of when you see something like that, it's not just up to one person to go, hey, don't do that, or hey, stop, or whatever, whatever the appropriate term is at that point. But it's something that we can all as a group, as a collective group, decide that we're not going to put up with.
Yeah, I agree. And to I guess answer your question about my books, I think you were asking,
Hmm.
um and it was a long question, so I might have forgotten the details of it, but I believe you asked what motivated me to use women of color.
Well, it's not just what motivated, but what message were you trying to give as part of using women of color as your protagonist throughout the series?
Okay, so yes, so first I used a black woman because I wanted to see, like, again, how a Wonder Woman would be treated if she was black.
Hmm.
I also felt like I didn't see enough black female or even women of color in general protagonists in literature.
Hmm.
or even cartoons or comics. You had some, but you didn't have a whole lot. If you did, they weren't as widespread or popular. So I wanted to create one.
Mm-hmm.
And the challenge is writing things from a woman's point of view that I know nothing about. I've obviously never been a woman before. So I kind of relish that extra challenge because now I have to do more research, right? I have to actually ask women what it feels like. Um, and even with my new series now, like I have a scene where a character has a boyfriend who's a jerk and he's a bad kisser. And I had to ask women what it's like to date a guy who can't kiss because I wouldn't know, and they told me. And I find that Aquila in particular, if I'm going back to my first protagonist, Aquila in particular, she bucks a lot of these social standards that people expect from women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, she's not um, dainty, obviously. She's not particularly nice. She's giving to the people she loves, and she'll protect those who can't protect themselves. But she's not particularly nice. If you catch her on a bad day, she'll cuss you out. She has so much trauma in relationships. She's hard to date. I wouldn't call her, quote unquote ideal wife. She does get married, but her husband has to really stick by her through a lot. Um, and she's allowed to be messy, and I think that the message that women are often sent is that they're not allowed to be messy. Men are allowed to be messy. Men can be broken. Men can be tragically flawed, and it's part of the story. But and in real life, they can be tragically flawed. If a woman is tragically flawed, it's like she's less than human.
Hmm.
And I wanted my characters, protagonists and antagonists, to be humanized and have tragic flaws. And Aquila, to me, has some tragic flaws. She has even some toxic beliefs based on how her childhood was. And I didn't want to just let a guy be the one who gets to be that and still be a likable character. I think that should be allowed for women too. I mean, with Wonder Woman, I don't always, well, with later versions, I think you might see it, but I don't always see like a tragic flaw with Wonder Woman. Even the way Wonder Woman's often drawn looks like a fitness model, not necessarily a warrior on a battlefield.
Right.
You look at people who are trained martial artists, like you mentioned, or boxers or fighters, they don't look like Wonder Woman. Um, she looks like she is genetically created to be appealing, to be strong, but still appealing to the male eye.
Mm-hmm.
There's no fighting benefit to giving her the tremendous breasts they always manage to give her in every single comic book. That's appealing to the male eye. And I have my covers with Akilla Johnson. If you notice, nothing I really make for her is revealing. And not that revealing is wrong. If you want to be revealing, you can. Um, but I don't design her to be appealing to the male eye.
Well, and also as a warrior, I've always wondered how a bikini makes for a good armor. So
Right, it doesn't. Right, it doesn't.
exactly, exactly.
It doesn't. It doesn't work. They're not. Neither do high heeled boots. Like you're not
Right.
gonna rush into battle with heels on, or out of hope. You
I
know.
absolutely. And I remember it's funny that you say that because I remember being struck by I do what I call cineparables and teleparables. I think in movies a lot and refer to movies a lot. In in the second Batman movie with Michael Keaton when Michelle Pfeiffer played Catwoman,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
remember she wore those high-heeled, very high-heeled boots when she was walking. But the stunt woman, when she was doing some of the stunts, you could easily see she was wearing these flat boots. And I'm like, why
Yep.
couldn't Wonder Woman just wear flat boots? Because she's doing all there's no way that you can do it in 5-inch heels. There's no way.
Yeah.
And so I remember being struck by that even all those years ago watching that. And this is going to sound a little weird and TMI maybe, but I'm going to say it anyway. So uh I have an issue with, and this goes to the idea of being sort of for the male gaze or paying more attention to that than paying attention to being a warrior. in the Wonder Woman movie, the one that just came out with Gal Gadot,
Mm,
um, there's a scene at which there, and in fact, it's one of the big pictures that they put up as sort of the tagline for the movie. It was always the poster. She's running towards you, and she's got her sword raised, and her armpits are shaved. And I thought to myself when I saw that why would the warrior women be shaving? Why would the
anything
Amazons shave their armpits? And
or anything.
right. Why would they do that? There is no reason. And I brought this up on Facebook actually and wrote a huge long thing about it because it doesn't make any sense to me. And there were people like, well, warriors shave that. No, the male warriors were not shaving their armpits.
No.
Never, never. And here's what's interesting about that. When you watch Black Panther, and there's a moment where you see I can't remember her name at the moment. She's the lead. She's the head of the guard, the king's guard, and I forget her name.
Okoye.
Uh, Okoye. So you see her, and she's doing kind of the same thing. She's rushing forward, and she has not shaved her armpits. And I was like, yes, that is what a warrior would do. She would not spend her time shaving her legs and her armpits and whatever. She just wouldn't. That's not her concern. Her concern is staying in training, knowing how to fight, protecting her king, protecting Wakanda. That's her thing. And so I just remember thinking that uh the juxtaposition of those two moments in those two movies was telling. That the warriors in Black Panther, the King's Guard had no that's they had what I would consider to be a focus that was more geared towards being a warrior than being, I don't know, a pretty lady, I guess.
Yeah,
So, do you understand what I mean?
I do. I do. And it's funny. It's good you mentioned that because I've pointed this out to my students. In Black Panther, you notice that in Wakanda, there's no notion that a man is better than a woman. And even T'Challa as the king doesn't lord over the women around him. They talk to him and he listens. He might not agree with them, but there's no impression that he feels like they're less than him. Whereas Killmonger treats women like garbage the whole movie.
Hmm.
And Killmonger grew up in the United States where a man acting like that isn't that uncommon.
Right.
And I always kind of point out to people that because I've seen writing where folks say Killmonger is a real hero, and I thought it was crazy because Killmonger again gives that quick and easy answer. But Killmonger is also a hypocrite. Like he says he wants to help black people, but you travel to Africa and killed a whole bunch of them. And last I checked, if you love black folks that much, you wouldn't treat black women the way you treat them in this movie. You shot your black girlfriend, and then a black woman challenges you, and you pick her up by her throat. Okay, that's how an abusive man treats women around him. And
Hmm.
I always say you can judge the character of a man based on how he treats the women around him. You
Hmm.
know, because chances are, if he's treating them like trash, what's he gonna do to anybody else who can't really defend themselves? Whereas T'Challa, you never see T'Challa try to hurt a woman once the whole movie. And he gets mad at Okoye once because Okoye actually crosses her boundary with him once, and he checks her there. But aside from that, he's very respectful. And I kind of craft my relationships and my stories in a similar fashion. There are no men who are better than the women in my stories,
Hmm.
except for the villains who think they are. Like Xerxes is a villain who has a really sick way of viewing women. He's really sexism embodied,
Hmm.
and he starts off as a sex trafficker, and he has a whole cycle going where he has a whole like cartel, and he has a cover with charter schools that he starts in the U.S. and he funnels students from those charter schools into his cartel. And
Wow.
then he uses his wealth. Yeah, he uses his wealth to actually buy private prison companies. So if they get locked up, they end up in his prisons. So he has a racket going, and he gains so much money that he essentially buys his way out of prison. He gets locked up eventually. A killer finds him. She wants to kill him, but she can't. The FBI gets there and they arrest him. And he essentially buys his way out of prison, and he buys his way and becomes the president. And when he becomes the president, he's obsessed with capturing Athena Johnson, the next protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
He wants her so bad that he starts a private military as president designed to capturing her. And they call him the Nephilim Task Force. And when you find out what his real goal is, he wants her DNA so he can use it. Again, this is the assumption of consumption.
Mm-hmm.
So he wants to use her DNA to modify his drug, and he offers for her to have his babies so that those babies will be the strongest warriors and they can take over the planet. And she shuts him down in pretty graphic fashion that I probably can't say here, but she tells him no, and she reminds him that the man she's with, David, is a much better man. And David makes considerably less money, but David's actually kind to her and actually cares about her. And Athena, to kind of flip that protector role on its head, Athena isn't used to protecting her boyfriends because they're normally regular human beings who can't fight like she can.
Mm-hmm.
And David's the first advanced human she's met who's not related to her, because all the advanced humans in the US are Ares' children at some point, so they're all related. So obviously they're not dating options. Athena meets David in South Africa, and that's when she realizes that there are advanced humans really around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And David's one in South Africa. And he's such a powerful figure in South Africa that he's nicknamed King David out there. And they meet and they're equals in almost every way.
Mm-hmm.
But when they practice, they spar together. She beats him every time. But they he is respectful towards her. They're equals. They have issues, but they're not. There's no kind of superiority there. Whereas a villain like Xerxes views women as objects to be used for his pleasure, for his political means, all that.
And
And
financial gain, obviously.
yes, and financial gain as well. And and if you don't do what he says, he finds a way to hurt you.
Right.
If not you directly, somebody close to you. So he and Aquila had beef for a long time, and Aquila's seriously after him, and she ends up kind of passing the mantle to Athena to take him down. And Athena is his target. He's obsessed with owning her, and I find that the more I learn about sexism, and as a man who's not on the receiving end of it, obviously I don't know as much as many women would. But I found that based on what women tell me and based on some of the conversations I've had with men who were clearly quite misogynistic, I found that what racism and sexism have in common is that whatever group you're kind of oppressing, you assume that they're there for your consumption. Men who are misogynistic assume that women exist for them, for their pleasure, for their gaze, for their use, for their satisfaction. And if you cannot use the woman, you discard the woman somehow. If she does not, and it's like you have ownership over her.
Mm-hmm.
And Xerxes is a villain who feels that way. If he can't use you, he discards you. Or if he decides he's done using you, he just discards you. And the problem he has with Athena is that he can't use Athena, but Athena's so strong he can't get rid of her either. Because now that you've ticked her off and messed with her and her family, now Athena's coming for you because Athena's a protector.
Right.
And Athena's not like Aquila. She doesn't have the same trauma as Aquila. But Athena fears losing her family more than anything else. And she'll do whatever it takes to alleviate that fear. So if Xerxes threatens her family, it kind of brings out the mother bear in her. And anyone can tell you a mother bear around her cubs is the worst thing you can come across.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's a sight to behold for sure.
Yeah.
My
Yeah.
stars. So shifting gears a little bit, tell me about the next series because you wrote the Nephilim, and then you are moving on to the Archangel series, and this first one is called Angel of Light. Can you talk a little bit about what that's gonna be? Before I know we could probably talk for the next 4 hours, but I'm sure you have a life to get back to. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, and then I have just a few last questions, and then I'll
Sure.
let you go enjoy your evening.
Sure. So I'm actually with the Archangel series. I'm still continuing with some of the same characters, but I have some new ones.
Mhm,
So Athena Johnson's still the main protagonist in the Archangel series, but her story will be a little bit different. And we have a new character, JoJo Johnson, who's actually one of the clones that Xerxes created. Obviously, she's female because he likes using women. And JoJo has to kind of discover who she is. Peter is another character who's an older character, and they're all kind of on this coming of age kind of story in Angel of Light. I
mhm,
use Angel of Light because in the Bible, that's often how Satan is portrayed. And the reason I choose that is because the story of Lucifer is how he rebelled against heaven. He didn't feel like he was getting his just due, so he rebelled against God. And there's a character who doesn't feel like she gets her just due, so she kind of rebels against the good, and she betrays the good guys.
mhm.
And she does it in a way that is very, very elaborate and very well thought out. And she works with a villain who's very charismatic. You know, Angel of Light is a way of describing evil that is very charismatic. You know, I remember in church when I was a kid, the pastor at the time kind of joked and said, you know, chances are if you meet the devil isn't going to be this big, ugly, demon-looking thing. It's going to be the prettiest thing you ever saw.
Right.
Because otherwise, how else would he seduce you into doing what he says? And the villain I have coming up is a very, very charismatic, very savvy, very strong political mind, and he knows how to convince people to work with him.
Right.
And he and the other character are both sides of that angel of light. And Athena and crew will have to figure out how to defeat them while learning about themselves and their new stages of life. The Archangel series will expand upon obviously some more religion and mythology, and I'm going to focus a lot on gods and angels and what it means to be a god and be an angel, regardless of what faith you may have.
Mhm.
I won't spoil the whole thing. I'll just say that um, the abilities that these characters had in the last series are going to be stronger because they're still learning about themselves as advanced humans. There's no school for it, so they have to learn on the fly, and they're still learning.
Right.
The more they learn, the more they realize they have more to learn. And Athena and JoJo in particular are going to be really good examples of that. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's I'm working on it now. I'm in the editing process with Angel of Light, and then I'm currently already writing the next book, but that's not going to come out for a while. Uh, and it's a lot of fun to write. It's a lot of research to write, but it's good. I don't know when I'll stop using these characters. I know eventually I'll have to, but they're so much fun to use.
Right. As long as the characters have stories to tell, you end up writing about them. I've written 2 fiction books, and the main character was named because when I wrote my first nonfiction book, we were talking about whether or not I should use a pen name because I have such an unusual name. And so my friend Eric suggested, you should use something. The book is a little new agey. You should use a kind of a new agey name. And I said, yeah, I could be Evening Star Songbottom. Ha ha ha. And then I thought about it and I went, Evening Star Songbottom. Who is this person? And that translated into the Fairy Godmother Diaries, which translated into book 1 and book 2. And I have book 3 in my head. And then I have book 4 and 5 that are planned out. And then I have sort of sideways novellas and other things. And it's just because I, off the cuff, said, I could call myself Evening Star Songbottom. And the characters are so much fun to write that I'm still finding ways that they fascinate me and that they have these stories to tell. So I totally know exactly what you're talking about there.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's lovely that it happens. So you've got Angel of Light coming up and the next one in the series. And then school maybe someday, but what are you doing now for the books that you already have? As far as, do you market your books? I'd love to know how you connect with fans, and in fact, if you wouldn't mind sharing your social media or your website, so that people who hear you here can follow you and learn more about your work.
Yeah, so I normally do it on social media. I have the same name on my Instagram and Twitter. It's No Apologies 14, and No Apologies was a blog that I had a while ago. I took down. I'm gonna remake a website later on, so I don't have a website right now.
Hmm.
But I post a lot of teasers, especially on Instagram, Facebook as well. A lot of teasers. I make a lot of comparisons to like the stories that inspired my work,
Hmm.
and I ask people questions. I find that getting people involved in the work kind of keeps them engaged. So if you ask them, "Hey, who wants to be a character in my book?" They kind of respond to that. I have characters in Angel of Light who resemble people on my social media because they requested to be in the book.
I love
And
it.
yeah, and they wanted to be villains for some reason. I said, "You guys know how horrible my villains are?" They're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Okay, sure." Like, and they wanted to be them, so they were. I market, but I find it's funny thing is I find that I've always sold better in person than online, and it's something I want to work on from this point forward,
Uh-huh.
because I can talk to you about my books and you'll be like, "Wow, you know what? I really want to read this." Okay, cool. I can sell something to you from talking to you. But online, I think it's a little bit more difficult because you have to think about algorithms, and you have to kind of break out of a saturated market.
Right.
And I'm working the kinks out. I'm working on hashtags and everything. I did have a hashtag that I started a while ago for Aquila. It's called Aquila Strong, and I would highlight women who were really athletic, men too, but usually women, who were boxers or martial artists or really good at calisthenics. And I would hashtag Aquila Strong to kind of honor them because they do the same things that Aquila Johnson would do.
Hmm.
So I still do that sometimes. I still have Aquila Strong on there, and I kind of do that. Um, but yeah, my books are on Amazon. I recently did new editions of the Nephilim Chronicles in 2018. So if anybody wants to grab those, they want to look up for the 2018 versions. You might still find the older versions, but they're frankly not my best work. I would call my newer ones much better. And in terms of the next book, that'll come out in December. So I am marketing it now, but I'm not marketing it too heavy until I get closer to the release date.
Hmm.
And then I'll
Hmm.
have more to say and more ways to advertise it. But I still post teasers. I post snippets on Instagram and my stories. I post quotes that people kind of like, quotes that show the personality of my characters. I have a character, Delilah, she's very cold and very serious. And then Peter's very serious and very jovial and funny and has a smart mouth. So like there's a part, it's one of my favorites where he in my next book where he's fighting a guy, and the guy, Peter basically tells him that he can't fight because he can't. The guy has no hand game. And the guy's like, "You saying I can't fight?" And Peter tells him, "I'm saying you swing like a baby hamster drowning in a bowl of milk."
Oh my goodness.
Right? Yeah, Peter's that guy.
Right.
And Peter and Delilah, they're like siblings who can't stand each other. They work
Hmm.
together. And Peter would poke and prod at Delilah, and Delilah would get mad at him and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of put those teasers in there that can be funny, can kind of give you an idea of what the story's about. JoJo is the character. She has almost no personality when she starts, but as she gets older, she develops one. And I kind of try to show that. And I feel like giving those snippets without spoiling the story can get people a little more engaged into finding out more about the characters you're quoting or
Yeah.
more about the environment. Waterbury is going to be a big part of my story. I teach there. I've grown more familiar with it. I've been there a few times before as well, but I've grown more familiar with it, and it's going to be a big battleground
Hmm.
for a lot of scenes. Hartford was a big battleground in the last series. So was Bridgeport. Bridgeport will be again, and so will Waterbury. So I kind of post some snippets about Waterbury and about how I kind of create a different world in Waterbury as well. So yeah, I try to advertise that way, and I'm gonna make another site this year. I have more time now. Obviously, I'm at home doing distance learning for my students, so I'm not running around as much. So I have more time to build up a site and advertise even more this summer.
Excellent. I'm so glad. And I would love to grab from you the links to the versions of the books that you want people to find. And
Yes.
I'll put in, of course, your Facebook and your Instagram links on the show notes. And yeah, so because this is fascinating, and I know we've been talking for ages now, so you're probably raring to go eat your dinner, and I totally get that. But I wanted to thank you very much for your wisdom and for writing these stories that are so compelling and informative on these incredibly important issues and topics. And to that end, I was wondering if I could give you just a little one last little bit of homework, if you will.
Mhm.
um, I would love it if you, this is a strange request, but it's something I ask of everybody who comes on the show. If you could have a bit of skywriting done that said anything you want and you knew the whole world would see it, what would you say?
Uh, Skywriting.
A
Uh,
message to appear in the sky that you knew the world would see. What would you say?
wow, that's a good question. That I knew the world would see.
Hmm.
Okay, so I guess in tying in everything we've talked about and kind of what I believe about the human condition, if I could write this in the sky, I would say I would write whoever you're talking about, whoever you're looking at, whoever you're watching, that person is a human being too. And it's a long skywrite, but I feel like that's what's easy to forget, even if you don't like the person. That person is human too.
Yeah, I think, you know what? It's our sky rating session. We can do what we want. And I think that's perfect.
There we go.
Well, Grant, thank you so much for joining me on the show. Folks, you heard it
Um,
here. There are going to be more books with these same compelling and exciting characters who are complicated and flawed, and heroes and anti-heroes and villains, and it's tales for the ages. So you need to get out and you need to read them. These are great books. So that is that. Grant, thank you again for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It was my pleasure, completely and entirely. My name again is Isolde Trachtenberg. I want to thank you for joining the Creative Mindset podcast. If you are liking what you hear, find Grant, follow his work, find the podcast, subscribe, tell your friends, leave a review, tell me what you're thinking, because this show has been shaped and is continuing to be shaped by what you're telling me. You've been saying you want more information on creatives and how they live their best lives. I'm bringing it to you every single week. So I hope that you do that. Keep talking, keep listening. Even more importantly, keep listening, keep being kind. This, once again, is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I will see you next time. Thanks so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. Today's episode was produced by Isolde Trachtenberg and is copyright 2020. Today's music was Kevin MacLeod's Ave Marimba, brought to you by Creative Commons License 3.0, and Summer Fashion by Alexander Shamaluev. As always, please remember this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Past performance does not guarantee future results, although we can always hope. Until next time, this is Isolde Trachtenberg, and I send you all of my love.